The Mitsubishi Zero is possibly the most famous Japanese aircraft of the Second World War, proving to be a formidable opponent to Allied aircraft during that conflict. Hello everyone, I'm Matt, this is Model Minutes, and join me on the workbench today as I build and review the A6M2b Zero in 1/72 scale from Airfix. For a deeper dive inside the box of this kit, check out the dedicated unboxing video I've already made on that topic. In this video I'm going to focus on what this kit is like to build, and then round off with a review at the end. I did already build this particular kit as part of a challenge a few years ago where I used some budget artist paints to see what I could do with it. I'm hoping that I might be able to get some better results in this particular project. I'll put a list of the products I used on the screen here to give you an idea of the things you might want to go and get if you fancy replicating what you see in this build. And without any further ado, let's get into it. As usual, I'll snip the parts that I need away from the sprue using my cutters. Any rough areas of plastic can be sanded down or cleaned up with a knife. The moulding is fairly crisp, so not much work is required here. Tamiya extra thin cement will be my glue of choice in this build. And unsurprisingly, my first steps were to build up the cockpit elements. The pilot's seat was glued onto the rear bulkhead, the control column was glued onto the cockpit floor, and this was followed by the control panel. That rear bulkhead could then also be added. This cockpit assembly could then be glued into one of the fuselage halves. I like to do these things at this point without any paint in the way to get a good plastic to plastic bond for the cement. In the Zero, the nose-mounted machine gun kind of breeches protrude into the cockpit, and these components represent this and are glued to the top of the nose, which I can add to the model shortly. I thought it would be fun to use some Tamiya paints on this project, so these Tamiya paints will be thinned down with Tamiya's acrylic thinner. First up, dark green XF81 was thinned down with about equal amounts of thinner to paint in the airbrush, and then this was sprayed over the internal cockpit areas. This might not be the most accurate shade for an internal cockpit of the Zero, but I think it'll do. And when it was dry, it was time to add the control panel decals. Some Humbrol decal fix would be painted onto the control panel, and then the included decals, which I've cut from the sheet and soaked in warm water, would be slid off the backing paper and correctly positioned. Some more decal fix should help soften them into the surface and stick them down. Some details in the cockpit can be picked out in some suitable colours. Humbrol 32, which is a dark grey, was painted onto some various controls and the top of the control column. Humbrol 62, which is a leather colour, was painted onto the headrest for the pilot. A pilot figure is included, and I've already painted this one off camera using my normal techniques. You might be able to notice that I did have to remove his feet in order to get them to fit correctly. This is a common problem with generic pilot figures, as they don't really fit every single different type of cockpit. And with that done, the cockpit is effectively complete, so I'm going to glue the fuselage halves together. A little bit of care just to get everything aligned, and when that was done, the top of the nose with the machine guns can be glued into place as well. So this aircraft comes with the option to have a underside fuel tank, and there is a slot here which allows you to glue that in. Interestingly, this is actually the perfect size for one of the old Airfix vintage display stands. And as there is a pilot included in the cockpit, I thought it would be fun to display this one in a flying pose. So I'm not going to install the underwing fuel tank, but will instead cut out this slot so I can install a display stand. No display stand is included, however, and this is a product I've had to purchase separately. The upper wing parts can now be glued onto the lower wing surfaces, and then the fuselage is added onto the wings. Just take a little bit of care here to make sure you don't have any gaps. The actuators for the ailerons can be glued into their slots in the wings here. And then I moved to the back of the aircraft and added the tail surfaces. These fit quite positively into their slots, and then the rudder can also be attached. As this is going to be in a flying pose, I installed the raised landing gear options. At the rear of the aircraft, the arrestor hook was glued into its slot, and the raised tail wheel in its correct position. The engine comes in a number of components. I did have to open up the hole for the axle for the propeller, and when that was done I added this axle inside one of the halves and then joined the two halves of the engine together. The idea here is that you should have a freely rotating prop by the end of the build. The propeller can be glued inside of the spinner. Do take care because it's a little fiddly. And then this retaining part is glued into the back. A pitot tube is glued into the leading edge of the left wing, and I do need to take care not to knock this off during the rest of the project. And then using a very tiny amount of extra thin cement, I glued the single piece canopy in place. Allowing a small amount of this cement to run into the seam using capillary action should give a nice strong bond and not react with the plastic. I then added the aerial mast in its hole in the back of the canopy. For this particular kit I've gone out and purchased this Eduard mask set for it. Eduard mask sets are generally high quality but a little bit more pricey. I thought it would be a good idea to get a mask set for this kit because there are loads of tiny little windows on this canopy. The relevant mask was peeled from the backing sheet and then carefully applied onto the correct panel. Canopy masks just make this a lot quicker, and a lot of the hard work is already done for you because they are generally correctly sized. Of course though, you are paying for that privilege. And with that done, it's now time to prime. Well, kind of. I'm going to do something a little bit different in this particular build. I'm going to use this generic metallic spray paint as my base colour on the entire aircraft. There is a method to my madness here. I'm trying out something new, and after a couple of thin coats of this silver spray, I was ready to move on to the next step. I've got a little bottle of this Humbrol chipping and scratching agent to try out, and I thinned this down with a little water and put it through my airbrush. What this should supposedly do, once it's kind of dried, is create a almost protective layer over that metallic paint finish. And after I've added the camouflage colours, I should be able to chip and scratch the paint back to this silver colour. I did find that this took a little bit of time to dry before I could move on to the next colours of paint. For the lower surface of the aircraft, I'm going to go with this Tamiya Deck Tan. Again, it was thinned down in almost equal parts with the acrylic thinner and was passed through the airbrush at a reasonably low PSI. This is just to try and avoid getting any splatter and give a nice smooth finish to the paint. I just built up the layers quite uniformly to get a nice even finish to the paint. For the upper surfaces, I'm going to go for this Japanese navy green, once again thinned down with some acrylic thinner. This was sprayed onto the upper surfaces and I haven't bothered masking the lower side. I'm just going to try and do this carefully, practicing my control of the airbrush to get the separation between the two colours as neat as I can. This was a little tricky, especially working along the fuselage sides, but I got to a point where I was reasonably happy and I moved on. For the engine cowling, I mixed together some black and US Navy Sea Blue, as there should be a quite dark kind of blue colour, and this was airbrushed in exactly the same manner. I left all of that to dry and then I came back to do some chipping. It is worth pointing out that this chipping fluid underneath all of this paint has made it a little bit tacky, but I think that's just it kind of working. So with a bit of water and a fairly hard brush and a cocktail stick, I worked back into the paint and tried to remove it almost as realistically as I could. I'm working around areas where perhaps crew and pilots have been climbing on the aircraft, any panels where there may have been maintenance, and just generally removing paint to give it a more worn feeling. I would do this on both the upper and the lower surfaces of the aircraft, and also the engine cowling. So that Humbrol chipping fluid should allow the upper surfaces to be removed back to that bare metal kind of finish I added earlier on. I'm under the impression that quite a lot of Japanese aircraft didn't have a primer coat underneath the paint, so the camouflage paint would be quite easily removed during normal operations. I'd leave that to dry and then get out this Vallejo black. I painted the rear surfaces of the propeller blade with this colour. Now to seal everything in, I'm going to use this Humbrol clear gloss. The idea here is that this should act as a protective layer and give a nice smooth surface in preparation for the decals. I think it is probably just worth mentioning that this Humbrol chipping fluid underneath all of these layers of paints is still making them a little bit tacky. I think it has quite a long drying time, so I would have to be super careful whilst handling this project in the next few steps. So one sheet of decals is provided, and you only get the one decal scheme included in this kit. These are manufactured by Cartograph to a nice quality, and I decided it would be better to cut this sheet into more manageable sections. Once I'd done that, I dipped the decals into some warm water to help release them from the backing paper. And if you ever get confused with your brush water and your cup of tea, don't make that mistake again by getting a dedicated brush water mug from my merch store, and you'll be helping to support the channel. VMS Decal Set and Fix and Decal Softener will be my setting solutions in this build. First up, the Set and Fix would be painted onto the areas where the decals are going to go. The decals, having been soaked in warm water, are then slid into position and allowed to soften into the surface details. The decal application stage was generally straightforwards. Perhaps some of the decals are a little thin in a few places and there was a little bit of a risk of them folding over or tearing. Some elements, like the leading edge yellow bands, probably could have been painted on, but with a little bit of care I did find I managed to get things in the right places. So yeah, decal application stage was generally okay. I did have to make sure not to forget to add the decals onto the propeller as well, as there are a few markings here. With that done, the VMS decal softener would be painted over the top of the decals to further soften them into the surface and give them a more painted on kind of appearance. When the decals had cured, a little bit more clear gloss varnish would be airbrushed over the top. This should help seal them into the surface and protect them in any further weathering that I might do. And speaking of further weathering, I'm going to use some of this Vallejo aluminium. So whilst I've chipped the majority of the aircraft, it does seem quite obvious to me that I've put decals over the top of some chipped areas. So I'm just going to kind of almost work back a little bit and add some chipping over the top of the decals just to try and make them blend in a little bit more with the chipped metalwork on this plane. When that was done, it was time to add a wash. I enjoy using this Humbrol 79 blue-grey enamel, which I thin down with some white spirit to make a very thin paint. This is painted over the entire aircraft, but taking care to try and avoid the clear canopy parts. I have found in the past that the white spirit can react a little bit with them and cause them to fog up, so I just don't apply this wash in that area. But everywhere else it would be painted over and allowed to run into the recessed details. This just adds some more dirt and grime and gives a more three-dimensional effect to those panel lines. Any areas of this wash I'm not entirely happy with could be reactivated with a little bit more white spirit and either removed or just moved around a bit more. I left that to dry, and then when it was ready, some of this K-Colors XW10 matte varnish was put through the airbrush and given a uniform coat over the entire aircraft. This should help dull down that gloss that was already on the model and give a more flat appearance. I'm going to do a little bit more weathering, so I added a few drops of black paint to the matte varnish as well to make a very thin black paint, and then this would be airbrushed onto the areas where there could be staining, such as around the engine and also the gun ports to simulate the guns having been fired. I tried to do this in the direction of airflow to give a more realistic look. With all of that paint now dry, I attached the engine onto the nose of the aircraft. This has just been left in the bare metal colour from earlier, but with that wash applied to bring out the details. The very dark blue engine cowling could then be glued on as well. and this was followed by the propeller. I do want to do one extra step in this, and that is adding the aerial wire. This Ushi rig that thing fine elastic thread would be superglued into the correct places. This is a very fine thread, and I feel like I might need a slightly thicker version because it isn't always that noticeable. It's also incredibly fiddly to apply. My process here is to get it to glue into one place, let that glue dry, and then stretch it to the next location and glue it there too. Any excess thread could then be cut away. With that done, I carefully peeled away the Eduard canopy masks, which have done a pretty good job of creating nice neat panel work on the canopy. And the final step is to install the clear display stand, which came separately, into that slot in the bottom of the aircraft. And with that, I'm going to call this build of the Airfix A6M2 Zero in 1/72 scale complete. And that's another build under the belt. So what I'm going to do is talk about the things I didn't really like about this kit and then swing into the more positive aspects. So the kit then hasn't really got that many negatives. It is maybe a little bit older in the context of Airfix toolings, seeing as this does date from 2011. So maybe the panel lines are a little bit deep and the quality isn't quite up to the standards that Airfix can reproduce today. But that being said, the build is quite pleasant. I think the main areas which let this build down a little bit are my own doing. So that metallic silver spray I used maybe was a little bit too hot, and I have noticed a little bit of orange peel texture in the plastic. So what I think's happened is the paint has reacted ever so slightly and caused it to ripple or slightly melt. Also, that Humbrol chipping fluid made the paint very tacky for quite a long time. I think there may be a couple of fingerprints visible in certain places as a result of this. It's just something to be aware of, and I know that the chipping fluid has to be a bit tacky in order to remove the subsequent layers of paint in order to give that chipping effect. It's not something I've done a lot of, so my experience here is a little bit limited, but it's definitely a lesson I've learned. Also, slightly annoyingly, there is a little bit of fogging I've noticed in a few places in the cockpit canopy. I think some of that wash must have snuck in a gap somewhere between the canopy and the fuselage and caused a little bit of a reaction. It's not massively noticeable, but if you go looking for it, you can see it in a few places. On a positive note though, the build is really quite pleasant. It doesn't take that long to do, and I keep a note of everything that I do in my modelling journal. So these are books that I've created as workbench companions to keep a track of your builds, and you can find them in the links below the video. In here, I've written down a note that this did actually take me a weekend to do, so only a couple of days to complete the project to this standard. So as I mentioned earlier, this kit has a tooling date from 2011, so it's not the most recent kind of thing in the Airfix current range, but the version I have here was actually produced in 2019. I think I must have purchased it around that time period, so I can't really remember what the RRP was at that time. There is another version of this kit available at the moment, but in a different paint scheme, and the price is £8.99. I don't think that's a particularly bad price, given the quality of the kit and the included options you get. So you do get a pilot included, you get the option to raise or lower the landing gear, and you get the centerline fuel tank as an option as well. Of course, in my example, I found the centerline fuel tank slot was perfect for a display stand. Display stands though, do have to get them separately. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I've actually already built this kit before, but I did so as part of a challenge, using some very cheap artist's paint to see how low cost or budget friendly I could make the project. I think it's safe to say that this version here, done with proper modelling products, does look a little bit better. I'm not entirely sure how happy I am with my chipping. I think it's an area that I need a little bit more practice in, but to give quite a worn effect to this aircraft, I don't think it looks too bad. But what do you think of my build? Let me know down in the comments below. I think as a quick summary, this is a low cost budget build, which has some quite nice features and can be done in a weekend. And in my particular case, it was perfect for trying out a new technique. As we've come to the end of the video, this is a great place to thank my Model Club members for the extra support they give the channel. Massive thanks to these guys on screen for helping me to create consistent content, and being part of the Model Club means they get exclusive access to early videos and other perks, and if you'd like to join them and get those benefits too, check out the links in the description. There are other ways to support the channel if you prefer, but the best way to support the channel for free is by subscribing with notifications turned on so you never miss a modelling upload. Finally though, last thing to say is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you on the workbench again next time.